What happens when British grit takes its last swing? Right as German precision is stepping into its prime, the ERF ECX and the MAN TGA hit the roads at the same time, but one marked the end of an era, the other the start of a new one. So, which one actually delivered more where it mattered? To understand what made these two lorries such icons in their own way, you've got to look at where they came from and what they represented. Let's start with the MAN TGA. Launched in 2000, it was part of MAN's big push into the new millennium. Clean lines, modular cab options, and a whole new generation of engineering underneath. It wasn't just an update of the old F2000 series, it was a reset. Aimed squarely at long-haul efficiency, fleet versatility, and driver comfort, the TGA was Germany's answer to modern logistics demands. It arrived ready to take on Scania, Volvo, Mercedes, and it had the spec sheet to back it up. Now, here's where it gets interesting. That same year, ERF rolled out the ECX, their final solo design before the curtain began to fall. Designed in the late 90s under British control, the ECX was built during MAN's ownership, which had begun in 1996 after MAN fully acquired the struggling British manufacturer. So while it wore a British badge and had that familiar ERF shape, it was quietly sharing more and more DNA with its German parent company. That created a bit of an identity crisis. The ERF ECX was meant to be a modern step up from the ES and ECS models. Better cabs, improved visibility, and updated engineering. But just as it hit production, MAN was consolidating, rebranding, and streamlining its range. ERF, for all of its history, was becoming less of a brand and more of a badge. So, on paper, two lorries launched the same year, but one was built to lead the future of European trucking. The other was built to prove the British could still keep up, even as the walls were closing in. Alright, let's climb up into the cab, where drivers actually lived with these machines. The MAN TGA didn't just look modern, it felt it too. The cab was a clean, no-nonsense space designed with long-haul comfort in mind. You had modular options like the XL, XLX, and XXL cabs, giving fleets flexibility and drivers room to breathe. The layout was typically German. Everything had a place, the plastics were solid, the bunk was wide, and the seats were built for hours on the motorway. It was the kind of cab that didn't shout about luxury, but if you drove one, you knew it had been designed properly. Ergonomically, it was spot on. The gear stick fell to hand, switches were where they should be, and even the dash display felt like a step forward from the boxy layouts of the 90s. Now over to the ERF ECX. This was a real effort to bring British cab design into the modern age, and for what it was, it did a decent job. Visibility was much better than earlier ERFs. The driving position improved, and it had a more refined feel than the ES series. But let's be honest, it still felt like a transitional cab. A bit of the old, a bit of the new. Build quality was inconsistent, especially in early MAN-owned models. Some drivers liked the no-frills practicality, but others mentioned flimsy dash panels and awkwardly placed switches. The bunk was decent enough for single-night stays, but if you were running Continental, it didn't exactly invite you to settle in. Still, there was a certain charm to it. British drivers who'd spent years in older ERFs appreciated the familiar feel, even if it wasn't as polished as the TGA. So, comfort-wise, the TGA wins on refinement and driver-focused design. No surprise there. But the ECX held onto that working man's feel, with just enough updates to stay relevant for a while longer. Let's talk engines, because under the cab is where the real character kicks in. The MAN TGA came with a choice of D20 and D26 inline-6 diesels, ranging from around 310 to over 480 horsepower depending on spec. These were clean-sheet designs at the time, developed to meet stricter Euro emissions while keeping power delivery smooth and predictable. And here's the thing, they did just that. Drivers liked the refined pull, especially in the 430 and 460 horsepower variants. They weren't explosive, but they were quiet, torquey, and got on with the job without fuss. Mated to Tipmatic automated gearboxes or ZF EcoSplit manuals, the TGA delivered strong motorway pace, decent fuel returns, and enough grunt to keep things moving with full-weight trailers. It was one of those setups that didn't need coaxing. You just pointed it and let it roll. Now the ERF ECX usually ran with Cummins ISME engines, a solid 11-litre straight 6 that produced anywhere from 330 to 440 horsepower. These engines were known for being reliable, gutsy, and simple to work on. You got that proper low-end shove, which made them great for stop-start UK work or hillier runs. They could be a bit louder in the cab and didn't have the silkiness of the MAN units, but they had a kind of working-class charm to them. All grunt, no nonsense. Some units also had ZF gearboxes, and when spec'd right, they drove pretty well. But again, it felt more mechanical than refined. Less glide, more grip. So, performance-wise, the TGA was smoother and more efficient, especially for fleets running long distances. But the ECX had that old-school British punch. Not as quiet, not as clever, but certainly not underpowered. And in the right hands, it could still shift. Alright, let's talk about what happened after a few 100,000 miles. The MAN TGA quickly built a reputation for being a well-engineered long-term investment. Its chassis was solid, with good corrosion resistance, and the electrics were generally dependable. A big step forward from the more temperamental systems seen in some 90s-era units. Everything felt tight, and even after years of hard graft, you'd open the door and still hear a reassuring thunk. That said, some of the early Tipmatic autoboxes could be a bit clunky, especially if they weren't serviced properly. But overall, it was a lorry you could trust to age gracefully, so long as you stuck to the service schedule. Now the ERF ECX. This one's a bit more complicated. Because while it looked like a continuation of British manufacturing, it was actually built in Germany by MAN, and the quality varied by year and spec. Earlier models, closer to the MAN takeover, were known to have some fit and finish issues, especially around cab trim and electrical components. You'd get reports of dashboard rattles, wiring gremlins, and other annoying faults that didn't always stop the lorry, but certainly tested your patience. On the flip side, the drivetrains were tough. That Cummins ISME engine was a real survivor, and paired with the right gearbox, it could easily clock 1,000,000 kilometers without major drama. And because it stuck with more traditional mechanical setups, repairs were cheaper and parts were easier to source, especially for UK-based operators. So where does that leave us? The TGA had the edge in long-term polish and structural integrity. It was built to be a flagship. The ECX was more of a wild card, reliable underneath, but sometimes let down by the small details. If you got a good one, you were laughing. If you didn't, well, you became very familiar with your local workshop. So, who actually ran these lorries, and how well did they catch on? The MAN TGA was an instant hit with fleets across Europe. From international hauliers doing pan-European work to major UK logistics firms, the TGA was seen as a modern, efficient, and low-risk choice. You'd spot them in the colours of firms like Stobart, DHL, Norbert d'Entressangle, and plenty of owner-operators who were stepping up from older MAN or Foden models. Its fuel economy, cab comfort, and broad dealer network made it ideal for fleets that valued uptime and resale value. And because it came with multiple cab and engine options, the TGA could be spec'd for anything: local delivery, long haul, even construction. It wasn't the flashiest lorry on the road, but it was consistent. And in haulage, that means everything. Now the ERF ECX? Bit of a different story. It found its way into plenty of small and mid-sized British fleets, especially those loyal to the ERF badge. There was real affection for the brand, especially in places like the Midlands and Northwest, where ERF had deep roots. But as MAN began phasing out ERF's independence, support thinned out, and buyers got nervous. The ECX never quite gained the momentum it needed to challenge the new wave of Volvos, Scanias, and yes, even MAN's own TGA. Parts availability became patchy, branding started to blur, and by the mid-2000s, most fleets saw the writing on the wall. Still, some operators swore by the ECX, especially those who wanted something familiar, affordable, and British-built. Sort of. And for a few more years, it held on. So, in terms of popularity, the TGA was a runaway success. Versatile, scalable, and well-supported. The ECX was a loyalist's machine, respected by many, but slowly pushed aside by the very company that made it. By the time the dust settled and both models gave way to newer tech, what legacy did they really leave behind? Let's start with the MAN TGA. This was more than just a successful model. It was the bridge to the modern era. It laid the groundwork for the TGX series, introduced later in the 2000s, which built on the same cab design, engineering principles, and driver-focused thinking. The TGA proved that MAN could compete on comfort and reliability, not just price. Even now, you'll still find TGAs racking up the miles across Europe and the UK. Some still in daily service, others converted into show lorries or training rigs. They've aged well, and in many cases, better than expected. It wasn't the most exciting lorry of its time, but it was one of the most dependable. Now the ERF ECX, that's where things get a bit more emotional. It marked the final chapter of the ERF story, a brand that once stood tall in British road transport history. The ECX was the last to wear the badge before MAN dropped it entirely in 2007. For a lot of drivers and fleet owners, it felt like the end of an era, not just for ERF, but for British lorry building as a whole. You don't see many ECXs on the road anymore. A few crop up at classic truck shows, restored by proud former drivers or preservationists. And when you do spot one, it's not just a machine, it's a memory of sandbatch, of steel dashboards, of a time when the UK still made its own hauliers. So, if the TGA was the beginning of something big, the ECX was the last breath of something treasured. Different legacies, but both worth remembering.